Hello, everyone. Welcome back to dinanddaf. This is Elana Stein Hain, and we are going to actually go 30,000 feet today. Between Mishnah 5 in Perek Gimel of Menachot and Mishnah 4 in Perek Dalet of Menachot, some of which we learn in this week's daf, we keep seeing the same concept mentioned over and over again. The concept of ikuva. The concept of, does something or its absence actually hold back the validity of a mitzvah? And I want to talk about this concept because it's different from saying, is something lechatchila or b'diavad, right? If something is lechatchila required, it means you should do it. If it's b'diavad okay, it means if you went ahead without it, after the fact, b'diavad, it's okay. Saying that something is not ma'akev is saying something far more radical. It's saying, even if you don't have it, you still do whatever it is that you do have. It does not hold back your performance of the ritual, the mitzvah, the process. That's pretty remarkable. And I want to think about what this concept tells us about halakha as a whole. I want to think about what this concept tells us about kudshim. I want to think about what this concept, or I should say, how this concept is understood a little bit more in a layered way. And that's why I want to start. I actually want to start with an understanding that there are two kinds of is this ma'akev questions. These two kinds of questions, one is actually typified by the first example that I'm going to give you, which is not from Menachot. This first example is really asking, what is the essence or the core of a korban? Meaning, what are things that if they are missing or are not done properly, they are ma'akev. Why? Because they are the core of what a korban is. That's one kind of ikuva. It seems like the kind of ikuva that we see in this week's daf and in those mishnayot from Gimel Hey to Daled Daled in Menachot are actually somewhat different. It's less what is the core, and it's more how independent are the different parts of a process. Are they independent enough that if you don't have one, you can still do the other? And those are the examples that we see in these mishnayot. They're certainly connected, these two, right? But I want to pull them apart a little bit. And this is not my concept. It's something I read in a paper that I don't know if it's been published. So I didn't put a quotation on the source sheet from Professor Moshe Halbertal, making the distinction between those two types of ikuva. So let's look at what I'm calling the first type, which I think is asking what is core to a mitzvah or to a ritual. So let's just take psukim in Devarim Perek Tet Zayin about the Korban Pesach, okay? Shamor et chodesh ha'aviv asita Pesach laHashem Elokecha ki bechodesh ha'aviv hotziacha Hashem Elokecha mimitzrayim laila. You should keep the month of Aviv, and you shall do the Pesach to God your Lord. Now I want us to know the Pesach here means the Korban Pesach, because in the spring month, God took you out of Egypt at night. The next pasuk, once we've already said V'asita Pesach, you shall do the paschal offering, we then have what seems to be somewhat of a repetition. V'zavachta Pesach laHashem Elokecha, you shall slaughter a korban Pesach to God Tzon uvakar, from the flock and the herd, and we're not going to deal with that right now. B'makom asher yivchar Hashem l'shaken shmo sham, in the place where God is going to choose to rest God's name. Now, when you look in the Sifrei is noticing all of this, the Va'asita Pesach, the Vizavachta Pesach, and this is Sifrei Dvarim, halakhic midrash on Dvarim. Vizavachta Pesach, it says, Shetehei shchitato l'shem Pesach. It's not for naught that it says you shall slaughter the Pesach, meaning you have to slaughter it for the sake of its being a Pesach sacrifice. Remember back to the very first Mishnah in Masechet Zvachim, that if you slaughtered an animal shelo lishma, a korban shelo lishma, it is valid, but it doesn't count for the korban that you promised to give, except in a few cases where it even invalidates. And one of those cases is the korban Pesach. So the shchita of the korban Pesach has to be for the sake of the Pesach. She'im shchato shelo lishmo pasul. If you shechted it not for the sake of a Pesach, it is invalid. Ein li shchitato, I only know that slaughtering it in a manner that is not for, or with an intention that is not for the sake of the korban Pesach, that invalidates. Minayin lirabot kibul damo rikat damo. What about other parts of the process of the korban, such as gathering the blood, catching the blood in a vessel, or sprinkling the blood? When you sprinkle the blood or you gather the blood, those are things that are also component processes of the korban. Do those two invalidate if they're not done l'shem korban Pesach? Talmud Lomar, therefore the Torah says, ve'asita, and you shall do. Meaning, it's not only v'zavachta Pesach, that you have to do the zvicha, the slaughtering for the Pesach. It's also ve'asita Pesach. Any of the doings you have to do for the shame of Pesach. Then the Midrash says, Yachol shani marbeh hekter chalavav. So then maybe also the burning of the fats on the mizbeach should also be something that if it's not done for the sake of the korban Pesach, it will invalidate. Or if it's done for the sake of something else, it will invalidate. Talmud Lomar, therefore it says, vizavachta, let's go back to this, vizavachta, the slaughter, meaning zvicha bichlal haita, slaughtering was part of the big comment of asita Pesach. You should make the Pesach, right? V'lama yatsa, but why did then the next pasuk specify slaughtering? La'aki shelaha, to basically connect anything that's like it. V'lomar lachan, to tell you, mazvicha miyuchedet shehi ma'akevet et hakapara, just as the slaughter of a korban is specific, it's unique, in that it is me'akevet, it actually withholds atonement. If you do not do the slaughter, it does not allow for atonement. Af kol shema'akevet hakapara, that also means anything else, such as, I would say, well, here at least 3, but generally we would say 4 component parts of a korban are generally ma'akev. They generally hold back atonement. If you do any one of them problematically, they hold back the atonement. And those are the shchita, the zavachta, the slaughter, the kabbalat hadam, accepting the blood in the bowl, the holachat hadam, bringing the blood over to the mizbeach, and the zrikat hadam, right? The placing of the blood, in general cases, on the altar. Okay, so those things are ma'akiv kapara. You know what's not? Yatzah haktara. You know what's not? The burning of the fats. She'ena ma'akivet et kapara. That generally we do not say that holds back atonement, meaning if for some reason the fats were not burnt on the mizbeach, we would still say that the atonement of the korban was achieved. Now, the fact that Chazal tell us that there could be a part of a korban that is core, meaning it's ma'akev the kapara, and a part of a korban that is not core, meaning even if you didn't do it, you still achieved kapara, that is a major innovation of Tannaitic thinking. It's a major innovation because you would have thought, look, if the Torah says to do it, you do it. The Torah says you're supposed to be burning the fats, you burn the fats. What do you mean you're telling me that if you didn't in the end, it's still... This whole concept of being ma'akev, or better yet, not being ma'akev, is kind of a shocking concept. And Halbertal in this article, which I guess I hope gets published, but or maybe it is published somewhere. Halbertal in his article talks about the fact that this actually really indicates two important things about the way that Chazal think about law. Number one, they're not hyperformalistic. If they were hyperformalistic, they couldn't possibly say, well, when the pasuk says X, well, this is ma'akev, but when the pasuk says Y, this is not ma'akev. They would just say whatever literally the Torah says, that's what's ma'akev, and that's it. It's always required, right? But the fact they don't says something about formalism, that they're not super legal formalists in that way. And another thing that he says is they're not thinking about korbanot as like necessarily in a mystical kind of way. I mean, he uses the word occult. They're not looking at it as like, well, this movement brings down this and this movement brings down this. So if you don't do this movement, you can't possibly achieve what the Korban requires, right? It's not a hidden, mysterious way of looking. It's this is the core and this is not the core, right? So it's really interesting. But that's not the kind of Eino Ma'akev that's in our mishnayot that I want to look at today. The kind of Eino Ma'akev that's in, and you know, obviously it's a cousin or a sister, right? Idea that Eino Ma'akev here is what if you have multiple component parts? It's not which one is core, it's can you have one without the other? So in this mishnayot and Menachot, we started with if you look at number two, the komets, right? That handful that you take of the korban mincha, of the flour. And what happens if you don't take all of it, right? Meaning, what happens if you don't use all of it? What if a little bit of it doesn't get used, right? So we say miuto ma'akev et rubo. Even a little bit held back and not used the way it's supposed to be used, that actually is ma'akev. And then it goes on to talk about other aspects of the korban mincha, right? Whether they're ma'akev or not. From there, and really what that's asking, it sounds like, is you have, most of the komets is being used properly. Some of it is not. Can you say that that most is enough on its own, right? We often say rubo kikulo, the majority is like all, right? What is the relationship of that miut, that minority portion, to the rest? Is it independent? Are they independent of each other, or are they dependent on each other? This whole question of dependence of different parts gets even more obvious when you go to the next Mishnah, which has nothing to do with ostensibly, with the Mincha. It starts talking about the two Seirim of Yom Kippur, the Seir LaHashem and the Seir LaAzazel. Shnei Seirei Yom Kippurim me'akvin ze et ze. The two goats on Yom Kippur, they hold each other back, meaning you can't do one without the other. You have to do both. And then, of course, it gets back to mincha because it starts talking about the lechem hapanim, which is a kind of mincha. But the point is, it goes through lots of numbers. The two Seirim of Yom Kippur, can you have one without the other? The two challahs on Shavuot, can you have one without the other? Let's go for other numbers. The three different herbs that you use for the paraduma, to create the paraduma ashes, right? Cedar, hyssop, and scarlet, right? Do you need all three of them? The four parts of a lulav, right? Do you need all four minim, right? It goes into the numbers. Do you need all four? Is it enough to have three? Is it enough to have one? Is it enough to have two? Or I shouldn't even say enough. It's do you fulfill something by having only that? We continue on with more numbers, right? The 7 branches of the menorah in the Mikdash. If you only have 6, does that do anything, right? The 2 parshiot in a mezuzah. If you only have one of those parshiot, does it do anything, right? The 4 parshiot in tefillin. If you don't have all 4, does it do anything? Now, all of Paragimel, in all of those cases, we say it is ma'akev, it is ma'akev, it is ma'akev. You need both parshiot in the mezuzah. You need all 4 parshiot in tefillin. You need all 7 branches of the candelabra. You need both of the Seirim on Yom Kippur, etc., etc., etc. When you move to Perek Daled, we continue down this sort of path of what is the relationship between different component parts of a mitzvah? Do they stand independent to each other? And we start giving the examples where they're not ma'akev each other. Parak Dalet starts with Hatchilat Eina Ma'akevet et Halavan, right? The blue color, blue dyed wool in tzitzis will not hold back white, meaning if you don't have blue, you just wear white. V'halavan eino ma'akev tchelet. And the same thing, if you don't have white, you just wear blue. Tefillah shel yad, tefillin of the arm. Eino ma'akevet shel rosh. It doesn't hold back the tefillin of the head, meaning if somebody only has one for some reason, just put on that one. That counts as something. V'shel rosh eino ma'akevet shel yad. And vice versa, right? Of course, we then get back to some aspect of the Korban Mincha as well. We start talking about whether the flour and the oil on one side, they are not ma'akiv. Wine libations, you can do a wine libation even without it, right? So we're now in the realm of, not ma'akiv. They're not ma'akiv. You can do one without the other. And then we continue to go in Korbanot land, right? When you have parim and you have elim and you have kvasim that are supposed to be part of certain korbanot on the festivals, and of course the Gemara, as you will see, or maybe you have seen already, goes into really interesting approach that it's not necessarily talking about, all the parim in the same korban or the elim in the same korban or the kvasim in the same korban, but maybe you're talking about from Vayikra to the example in Vayikra on Shavuot to the example in Bamidbar on Shavuot, but we're not going to go into it right now. And then you have, again, ultimately, we get back to Lechem in the next one and basically tries to figure out if on Shavuot, if you don't bring the loaves, the two loaves, the Shtei Lechem, the wheat offering, which is parallel to the Korban Omer on Pesach. This is, right, 7 weeks later. It's the wheat offering. If you don't bring the lechem, can you bring the animal? If you don't bring the animal, can you bring the lechem? Right? And then ultimately it ends with, I think, the best, way to end the frame of, well, but about a korban tamid, right? Korban tamid, the daily offering you give in the morning and you give one in the afternoon. What happens if you're missing one? Do you still give the other? Right? So it's really giving you like the bigger picture and also starts to talk about the question of whether you missed it on purpose or you missed it by mistake, right? So that's basically what those mishnayot are doing. They're going through examples where things are ma'akiv and then examples where things are not ma'akiv, right? So this is really interesting. How are we supposed to understand what this is trying to do? Because I understand if you say to me, well, I'll tell you, these are the 4 parts of the avoda of a korban that are ma'akev. What you're trying to help me understand is that these are the core parts of the avoda. But when you say to me, is the tefillin shel rosh ma'akev, the tefillin shel yad, you're not asking me which is core to tefillin. Of course, they're both core to tefillin. You're asking me whether they're independent of each other. And so the Rambam in his Sefer HaMitzvot actually, when he lays out, before he enumerates all 613 mitzvot, he lays out principles by which he does his counting. And he says, Ashorish HaCharasar, the 11th principle is, She'ein ro'i limnot chelkei mitzvah befrat chelek bifnei atzmo, kisheyeh mekubatz me'em mitzvah achat. I'm not going to count separately parts of a mitzvah where, yes, there are component parts, but coming together, they're all considered one mitzvah. And then he starts to explain. Sometimes you'll have a single mitzvah that has a number of parts. Kimo mitzvah lulav, like lulav, sheyar ba'aminim. It's 4 species. Hine lo nomar ki pri etz hadar mitzvah b'fnei atzma. I'm not going to say the etrog is a separate mitzvah. Kabot varim mitzvah b'fnei atzma, and the palm frond is a separate mitzvah. Vanaf etz avot mitzvah b'fnei atzma, and the myrtle branch is a separate mitzvah. Varei nachal mitzvah b'fnei atzma, and the willow branch is a separate mitzvah. Lifi she'elu kulam em chalkei mitzvah, because they're all part of the mitzvah. Ki hu tzivah lekabtzam, because God commanded us to gather them together. V'achar kibutzam tiyeh mitzvah lekichat hakol biyad. And once we've brought them all together, there's a mitzvah to take them in the hand on a particular date. But then he says, I have to admit though, v'omnam makom hakoshi hu b'dvarim she'amru b'hem einan ma'akvin zeh zeh. He says, here's where I have a problem. I understand that in general, I want to say different parts of a mitzvah. If they're all part of the same mitzvah, ultimately, I don't count them separately. But what about situations where Chazal said, This part of the mitzvah is not ma'akiv that part of the mitzvah. This part of the mitzvah doesn't hold you back from doing that part of the mitzvah. Ki ha'oleh b'machshava, right? Excuse me, the problem is where Chazal say these things are not ma'akiv each other, these different components of a mitzvah. Because I would have thought if they're independent of each other, of course they're separate mitzvot. Like they said, right? The blue in tzitzis does not hold back the white in tzitzis. The white in tzitzis doesn't hold back the blue in tzitzis. I might have thought that I would say the lavan of tzitzis and the tchilah of tzitzis should be counted as two different mitzvot. Except for the fact that the Mechilt of the Rabbi Shmuel says clearly, this is what it says, Sham, this is what it says there. Shehen shtei mitzvot, mitzvat chilet, umitzvat lavan, right? They said yachol shehen shtei mitzvot. You might have thought that they're two different mitzvot, a mitzvah of chilet and a mitzvah of lavan. Talmud lomar. Therefore, the Torah says v'haya lachem letzitzit, and it shall be for you for tzitzit, meaning mitzvah achat hi ve'ena shtei mitzvot. It's not two mitzvot, meaning he tells you that as soon as you say that these things are independent, what it makes me think is maybe they're two separate mitzvot, right? But he says, I don't know, because when it comes to tzitzis, for example, we have a direct mechilta, a direct midrash halakha on Shmot that says, nope, they're one mitzvah. Why? Because we have a pasuk that says, "V'hayalachem letzitzit," and it shall be tzitzit. Otherwise, I would have thought that they're two mitzvot. Hinei kvarit be'er lecha. So he says, okay, so now you understand this. She'afilu halakim she'enan me'akvin zeh zeh, pa'amim yiyu mitzvah achat. He said, okay, here's what I understand. Sometimes, even if component parts of a mitzvah are not ma'akiv each other, meaning they stand independently of each other, they still might be part of one mitzvah. If they are, I don't know, inyan echad, I'm saying is like the same theme. If they're trying to accomplish the same thing. The point of tzitzis is so that you'll remember the Torah. You'll remember the mitzvah. Im kain, if so, klal hadavar mechayev, or maybe kalal hadavar mechayev lizikaron, mitzvah achat yimaneh. Anything that is part of that, causing a remembrance of the mitzvot, is going to be part of one mitzvah. The blue, the white, all of it. Hinei lo nish'ar lanu im kain. He says, so therefore, here's what I'm left with. When I think about the fact that where they tell you if they're ma'akiv or they're not ma'akiv, are they dependent on each other or are they independent? It's really, I have to consider the question of not are they ma'akiv each other, but are they the same thing? Are they trying to do the same thing? Meaning, are they one thing or are they multiple things? As we explained in the ninth principle. Meaning, basically what the Rambam gives you is, when Chazal are trying to figure out if the two Seirim of Yom Kippur are ma'akiv each other, right? They're not trying to tell you what's the core of the mitzvah. They're trying to tell you, certainly if they're dependent on each other, they're a single mitzvah. But if they're not dependent on each other, is that trying to say they're different mitzvot? Or maybe it's trying to say that they're still part of the same mitzvah if they're inyan echad, but within that mitzvah, maybe there's different pieces, right? Meaning, so that's sort of what we left with this idea of Eino Ma'akev. Because on the one hand, sometimes they're probably saying when it's Eino Ma'akev, they're trying to say they're really independent mitzvot. And then other times they're saying, well, maybe they're independent pieces within the mitzvot. And by the way, if you look at the Rambam, and for time, I'm not going to read it. If you look at the Rambam, Sefer HaMitzvot, the positive commandments 12 and 13, he counts the Tefillin Shel Yad and the Tefillin Shel Rosh as two separate mitzvot. Not because they're not ma'akiv each other, but because actually the Gemara says, our Gemara in Menachot says, what do you mean? Mandalet le'shtei mitzvot, chada mitzvah lo li'avid, right? It says when it's talking about the fact that they're not ma'akiv each other, right? Which for the Rambam is not enough to say that they're two mitzvot, uses the language of if somebody doesn't have two mitzvot, should they not do even one? Meaning, if they don't have both tefillin of their head, the head tefillin and arm tefillin, should they not even do one? And it uses the term mitzvah. Otherwise, the Rambam would not be okay classifying it as two mitzvot just because they're not ma'akiv each other. But either way, there is a question here of how independent. Are they independent enough even to be considered two different mitzvot? Or are they independent enough that even within the same mitzvah, there's a little bit more going on? Okay, so that's basically some of the big ideas already that we get from the notion of things not being ma'akiv each other, right? The idea that maybe sometimes we're telling you what the core is, versus what, the more supporting activities are as opposed to the core activities. And sometimes what we're trying to figure out is to what degree are the component parts of a mitzvah independent of each other, and even to what degree are those component parts of mitzvah actually separate mitzvot themselves. I want to do one more thing, and this is an interesting thing. It turns out, if you were to ask yourself, what's the default? Do you think the default should be that anything that's written in the Torah about a ritual, about a process, about a mitzvah, should be ma'akev, right? Or unless otherwise specified. Or do you think the default should be it's not ma'akev unless we specifically say that it is ma'akev? Now, here's an interesting thing. The Gemara in Pesachim, and I urge people to look at the source itself, the Gemara in Pesachim actually talks about the need, and it's specifically talking about a Korban Pesach, but the need for the Torah to say something multiple times when it comes to the Korban Pesach to show that it's ma'akev. Specifically, the example is the eating of the Korban Pesach. The way the Gemara phrases it is hakatuv shana alav la'akev. The pasuk says it a second time in order to make it ma'akev, right? Meaning, it sounds like the default is that it wouldn't be considered ma'akev, but because the Torah, particularly in the case of achila, in the case of eating of the Korban Pesach, went out of its way to specify eating multiple times, it tells you that it's ma'akev. Now, an interesting thing is Rishonim assume that concept, that the default is that things are not ma'akev, meaning if you don't have them, it's still a valid korban. Or if you did it wrong, it's still a valid korban, unless the Torah somehow indicates to you in a special way that they should be ma'akev, that's only the case in kachim. It's only the case when it comes to korbanot. It's not the case in other mitzvot. And in fact, the Balei Tosfot are trying to understand why the Gemara on Lamed Chet, Menachot, which, Lamed Chet and Aleph, where the Gemara says, Im hikdim tchelet lelavan yatsa, that if someone put tchelet on first, before their lavan, before their white strings, they biyotze, Tosfot don't understand it. They say, what do you mean? Shouldn't the order be ma'akev? We learned from a pasuk that the lavan's supposed to come first. And generally speaking, he doesn't say it exactly this way, but I'm like adding a gloss. Generally speaking, outside of kachim, once it's in the pasuk, it should be ma'akev, unless you have something that's going to remove it from being ma'akev, right? So that itself is a fascinating concept. Meaning, what do you mean? What do you mean? The default generally in mitzvot is that if it's written in the Torah, it's ma'akev, unless you can figure out a way to learn that it's not ma'akev. Now, that to me seems like a very reasonable default. Why in kachim is the default the opposite? Why in kachim is the default that it's not li'ikuva, it's not something that is going to withhold, invalidate the korban, unless the Torah tells you it by means of something more explicit than just mentioning it once, right? So what is that about? And I want to end with this idea because I think it's really beautiful. Oftentimes the questions are better than the answers. I want to admit that, but I think sometimes the answers give rise to beautiful ideas. So this person named Rav Michal Avraham, who I do not know, I was just doing research, and he was the person who was writing about this klal, this concept of shana alav hakatuv la'akev, that the Torah says something repeated in the case of kodshim in order to make it ma'akev, and without that, it wouldn't be considered ma'akev. He says, "Im adam hikriv korban ba'ofen intuitivi," if a person intuitively, in an intuitive manner, gave a korban, mitoch regesh tiv'i shelo, from just a religious feeling, a spiritual feeling. Haresh yesh kan avodat Hashem. This is worship of God. Gami muasazot shelo pi halakha. Even if they didn't follow all the strictures of halakha. Sof sof hukrav kan korban v'nevda kan avodah. In the end, this is a korban. This is avodat Hashem. Hamaskana, the conclusion is shekasher haTorah kovat pratei halachot legabe korbanot. When the Torah establishes detailed laws regarding korbanot, it's not coming to uproot the natural, organic worship of God. Before there was any mitzvah of korbanot, many of our ancestors, many of our patriarchs, and Gentiles also gave korbanot to God. Just like people used to pray before there was any command to pray suggested by the rabbis. B'shnei hamikrim, in both situations, whether tefillah or korbanot, hatzivuy hilchati, the halakhic command, lo ba b'mkom harovet hativi pashut, it's not coming instead of the natural, simple layer of avodat Hashem, ela b'tosefet elav, but rather it's coming to add to it. Lachein, therefore, gam im adam asa tadvarim shelo pi pratei halakha, even if a person did things as the worship not following halakha, meaning avodat Hashem, not avodat something else. Sof b'mitziut yesh kan avodah. In the end, this is worship. V'hu yikabel aleh, and a person will get reward for them. And then he goes on, he says, Mikan nolad haklal shebekodshim. This is exactly where the concept, exactly where the principle in kodshim comes from. Ba'inan shana alav hakatuv la'akev, that you need the Torah, right? Kol od lo nechtevu dvarim mefurashim. If there haven't been written explicit things, ein siba la'aniach sheprat hilchati shelo kuyam okeret hamashma'uta intuitivit shel avodat Hashem shebakrat hakorban. There's no reason to assume, unless it's been stated explicitly in the Torah, there's no reason to assume that a person's, intuitive meaning and the intuitive way of giving the korban would uproot the legitimacy of the korban halachically. It's only if the Torah writes explicitly that it undermines the avodah. Maybe it repeats the requirement again. Or the Torah, lists something that tells you it should be precise, like chukah. This is the statute; it has to be done this way. Rak azina karet. Only then is the intuitive way that you did it, that was not al pi halakha, uprooted. B'mikrim elu, in these situations, haTorah mechadeshet, the Torah is innovated sha'avodah shenesta b'ofanim hakodmim, that avodah, that worship of God that is done through the old ways, hi psula, it's invalid. V'lo rak lo mishlemet, and not just imperfect. Ach l'shem kach, but in order to establish this, nidrash makor miyuchad, you need a specific source. Uvirat hamechdal hi shelo zeu hamatzav, and the default is that this is not the case. What a beautiful way to explain the idea that you might start with the default, that that aspects of the korbanot would not be ma'akev or not be ma'akvin, really trying to tell you that we recognize the desire in a human being that predates the Torah. We recognize the desire in the human being to do some worship before God. Now, of course, the Torah is then going to set it out and help us understand how to do it and how to shape it and what's the right way to do it. But at the same time, even in there, there's a give and take in terms of what happens if all of the pratei halachot, all of the details of halakha are not fulfilled in that regard. As always, thank you for learning with me. Until next time.